Hi, welcome to Midwest Magic Cleaning. My name is and I get so many questions about hoarding disorder that I have decided to put together one all-encompassing video that's basically a hoarding disorder 101, where I answer questions and questions like, how do I confront somebody with hoarding disorder? What can I expect when I'm helping? There's a lot of information to cover, so let's jump right into it. I want to start out with some information that longtime viewers have heard before, but I want to reiterate this point because people who are just coming in here for the first time need to know this information. And that is, what is hoarding disorder? So hoarding disorder is a neuropsychological disorder, which basically in layman's terms means that there's a physical problem with the brain that manifests in psychological ways. It triggers this psychological outcome. When they put people under a brain scan who have hoarding disorder, they notice that the two frontal lobes have extremely diminished activity compared to the average everyday neurotypical person. And those lobes tend to regulate things like emotional control and emotional regulation. And the other one tends to deal with things like heavy decision making. So there is a problem with them processing emotions versus decisions and action. And it develops into a psychological disorder that becomes almost impossible to negotiate with. Now, that means that the hoarding disorder is kind of always present in the way that alcoholics are considered alcoholics forever. They've got a problem with the brain that is only exacerbated by alcohol. Like alcohol is the symptom and not the problem. It's not the cause of alcoholism. It's the brain that's the cause of it. That said, hoarding disorder is almost always triggered by trauma. Hoarding is like the go-to response for trauma because buying stuff, keeping stuff, acquiring stuff gives them that dopamine hit and that feeling of security in the same way that alcohol provides that to an alcoholic. Now, it's not always triggered by trauma, but it usually is. The thing that I don't think a lot of people understand is that there's multiple contributing factors to hoarding disorder. So we've talked about the physical brain function being diminished, and specifically in those two frontal lobes. But there's also a genetic component. I believe they found 2 genes that are specifically associated with most people with hoarding disorder. But there's also an environmental factor in which if you grow up in a house that is hoarded, there's a larger chance that you yourself will become a hoarder. It's not guaranteed, and in many cases, the people go the opposite route. They become ultra clean, but it actually increases the risk in most cases. Now, for a long time, people thought that hoarding disorder was a form of OCD, and it kind of is. They're more like cousins, but they're not the same thing. Modern studies have shown that OCD and hoarding disorder are their own separate entities. They react differently in the brain. They manifest in different ways, though they have some similarities. There's obviously the obsession. There's the compulsion to buy things, to collect things, to not throw away things, and it is a disorder. So if you took things literally by the acronym of OCD, you would think that hoarding disorder is a form of OCD, but it's their own separate entities. They just have a lot of similarities. Again, they're more like cousins than brothers. So let's talk about one of the more interesting facets of this disorder, which is the stages. So there are 2 scales that people use to define hoarding disorder. One of them is a lesser known scale that's a 1 through 9 scale, and that typically just references the severity of the hoard itself, the physical stuff that's in the house. But the more common is a 1 through 5 scale that takes into effect the stuff in the house, safety hazards, the mental decline of the person who lives in it. There's a whole bunch of factors that goes into it. So I'm going to go through each of these stages, and I'm going to give you examples of stuff that I've filmed that represents each one of these stages. So level 1 is pretty simple. There's a small amount of clutter in the house that's more than like the average house, but the owner still has a little bit of difficulty letting things go, but all the home is accessible. There's no real damage or anything to the house. The wife in this particular instance was not happy that we were in there cleaning, but it was a rare case where the husband had came to me and said, This is affecting my relationship. I'm to the point to where I'm getting ready to leave if something doesn't change, or they're going to have, a big argument about it if they hadn't already had a million arguments about it. It was causing problems in the relationship. I went in and did it, and normally that's not what I do, but I usually have to be on board with everybody in the house before I'll do it. We did not throw a bunch of stuff away from this house. We just packed it up and made it way more organized and found solutions for storage. But overall, this was a pretty minor case. It was hoarding disorder. I did tell the husband this, but I said it's not out of control to where it's affecting your everyday life. Stage 2, the clutter starts to accumulate. Now, typically, at least one room is inaccessible, and there was one room that we really couldn't enter. And inaccessible doesn't mean that you just can't get into it, but it's inaccessible and or unusable. This house did have at least one of those rooms. The hygiene of the person tends to deteriorate a little bit, and the home has a smell. Not an overpowering smell, but if you've ever been inside a hoarded house, you'll know what smell I'm talking about. It's a little bit of rot from the trash being around, or the smell of roaches. Roaches have sort of a chemical type of smell to them, but there's always some sort of, a little bit of rotten milk, stuff like that. It's not overpowering, but you can definitely tell that it's there. At level 2 or stage 2, the home is showing some signs of disrepair, and it doesn't mean that a bunch of stuff is broken, but like paint on the walls needs to be refreshed, or it needs to be repainted because paint's chipping off. The cleanliness of things like the sinks and the countertops are starting to get out of hand. The cabinets look like they could be refinished, stuff like that. Small, minor repairs that wouldn't take much to get it all fixed up. And that's what this house had. Typically, this is where you start to see the social interaction of the person who has the disorder. It starts to decline. They stay in a little bit more. They don't go out as much. They don't really let a lot of people into their house because of embarrassment, but it's not to the point where it's really affecting their social life. It's just starting to appear. Stage 3 is a lot more severe. This is where most of the houses that I've done on this channel are stage 3 or higher. This one has a noticeable impact on the person's life. The house smells pungent. It smells a lot worse. It's not really to the point where you have to put on a respirator to block out the smells, but it's definitely not pleasant. There are roaches, rats, or mice. Some sort of pest is present. In this particular house, they had roaches, bugs, and a lot of mice. In a stage 3, several rooms are inaccessible, and minor repairs are now major repairs. So in this particular one, there were several rooms that you couldn't really enter, or if you entered them, you couldn't really walk from one side to the other. There was problems with, like, the kitchen sink was completely broken. You couldn't use it. I think the stove had problems. There was plumbing issues. The floor was starting to rot out in the kitchen, where if you stepped in the wrong spot, you were going to go through the floor. This is where it gets severe enough to where things like DCFS could be called in. You could start to have a little bit of legal issues, but nothing that's going to get you kicked out of the house. They will just basically come in and say, you have a month to clean this up and do some repairs. It's what I run into the most often. And this is the saddest, because it could have been prevented. And now, instead of preventing these things from happening, it's going to cost thousands of dollars to fix the broken stuff in the house. Stage 4, most of the house is inaccessible or unusable. There's often a lack of utilities. So in this case, there was no hot water. There was problems with water in general in the house. The pests were out of control. It had more roaches than any place I'd seen up until this point. The home starts to present a significant health risk. And in this particular case, there were so many roaches that it was a health hazard. There's often structural damage to the house, which this one did have. You can actually see the floor bowing in several places where the house had started to kind of shift in its foundation. Hygiene is severely neglected. You can tell that they haven't used their shower in ages. The toilets are usually black with mold and lime scale and stains, if the toilet works at all. And in many cases, it doesn't. There are problems with the plumbing in the sink being disconnected or in disrepair to the point that it needs to be replaced. And the amount of stuff is getting so bad that it's very difficult to go from one side of a room to the other. if not impossible, to go from one side of the room to the other without taking stuff out. Level 5, I've only done a couple of these on the channel, but basically the home is filled to capacity. That's where you start to see pathways through the house where they walk. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to be so severe that it's like the show Hoarders where it's stacked to the ceilings. Those are a percent of a percent of a percent chance of finding those. Those are the most extreme cases in the world. The pathways I'm talking about are typically there's room to walk in one area of the room just to get through, and the rest of the room is piled up with stuff. Utilities are often entirely gone. In this particular house, there was no water, no hot water, let alone cold water. The toilets didn't work. There was no heat, no air conditioning, no gas. It was basically just a shell of a house. There were structural damages to the point that the house was not safe to live in. More roaches than I've ever seen in any house. Mice everywhere, mouse poop everywhere. It was a significant health risk. You could smell the ammonia in the air to the point that I told the family she's going to die in this house if she's left here. They eventually had to abandon the home, and the original owner is going to tear it down. Like, there's no saving it. That often in stage 5, they face legal issues, including loss of a children. People can be fined or jailed for allowing it to get this badly. In this case, they did have legal issues. The home was under threat of condemnation for a long time. They gave her a certain amount of time to fix certain things, and she didn't get them done. So they'd been to court a couple of times over, them in the house versus the landlord who wasn't doing anything. It was just an absolute mess. But yeah, it poses severe health risk beyond just the pests. Like, for instance, there's a risk of fire. If there's a spark that lands in the middle of this hoard, it's going up like a Roman candle, and there's no stopping it. There's a risk of disease from the pets, the risk of mold, which this house did have quite a bit of black mold in it. I mean, at this point, this house was at risk for ammonia poisoning from the amount of cat feces that covered the entire house in every room. There were puppy pads all over the place that hadn't been really changed. They were just there. It was really bad. It was a severe safety issue. So that brings me to the question that I get more than any other, which is, how can they live like that? And to be honest, the question itself is a little bit odd, because it's like saying, how can people with severe OCD live with having to flip off and on a light switch over and over and over again? Like, they have to hit a certain number before they leave the room. Like, how can they live with that? They can just not do that, right? Or how can a paranoid schizophrenic live with the delusions of being spied on? We can easily prove that they're not being spied on, and then they can just stop doing that. It is, in a large way, not a choice for them. Remember, this is a mental disorder. It's a mental illness. They oftentimes are faced with fight or flight mode whenever they're faced with getting help or making large decisions. And so you can get around that with the way you handle it, which we'll get to here in just a minute, or with the right treatment and all that stuff. But it doesn't take away the fact that once you start going through their stuff and you start to throw it away, it triggers the disorder itself. It's not them making a choice and saying, I'm going to be angry because you're throwing away my garbage. They're not thinking with the same logic that you and I think with. So trying to battle their compulsions with a logic that they don't have is like trying to saw wood with a hammer. It's not compatible. You have to be able to speak to them using their logic. So if they can't control it, how can the family let them live like that? And the problem with that is that the family can clean the house. That's the easy part. The cleaning part is just mechanical. But what they can't do is erase or cure the disorder itself. So like one of my TikTok followers put it, it's like asking why the family didn't cure their cancer. The pushback that family receives when trying to help is absolutely brutal. And eventually, after years of trying to help and meeting that pushback, they just give up for the sake of their own sanity. It may be shocking, but in many cases, the family didn't even know that it was that bad because they weren't allowed in the house. So the social isolation is very common with people with this disorder because they don't want somebody entering their house, seeing it, and then turning them into the authorities or causing a scene or giving conflict. So that fight or flight response that I had talked about a little bit ago is what the family is met with every time they try to help. Either they're met with the fight part of it, which is the person saying, you're not going to throw away any of my stuff. They start arguing, they start yelling. Sometimes they can get violent. The other part is the flight, where they'll just say, well, you just make all the decisions for me then, like this super passive aggressive response. And they'll just leave and they'll say, you just take care of it. I'm not even going to, I guess I don't get a say in this whatsoever. And they'll just leave. Or like I encounter a lot, they'll say, do what you want to do. I just can't see it happening. Don't show me what you're throwing away. Just throw stuff away. And that's not really helpful for them. They need to be a part of it. And if that's all the case, how do you confront someone with hoarding disorder? Well, first we need to get around the word confront, because in almost all cases, the person with hoarding disorder is very, very defensive. They don't want to be accused of anything or blamed of anything. You can't come at it with a lecture. They can't feel like they're in trouble for this. If they feel that way and they start getting extremely uncomfortable about the process, it's going to possibly push them further into hoarding disorder, because the way that they deal with anxiety is to buy stuff and collect stuff. If you're causing them anxiety, then they're going to go out and try to treat that with the dopamine that comes from buying and collecting stuff. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's a catch-22. In many ways, it has to be treated like an intervention. So you're going to have to come to them with kids' gloves and say, I personally would make this about myself and probably their grandkids or their children, and say, look, the condition of your house has gotten so out of control that I can't bring my kids here anymore. I can't personally show up because it's so toxic. I can't be in here. Like, you have to phrase this as how the house affects you, but it can't be done in a way that is accusing them of wrongdoing. You basically have to focus on safety and avoid ultimatums and lectures. Remember, these people are often embarrassed and don't want to live like this, and many times they're unwilling to admit that there's even a problem, and in many cases they'll blame other forces for the house being in that condition. Like, you kids are the one that caused it because you never picked up after yourself, or I do everything around here and nobody helps me, and that's why the house got into this condition. It's why you often need a professional there whenever you're confronting or doing an intervention. Remember that even though you're doing the mechanical cleaning of the house, the hoarding disorder itself requires usually a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy long-term and usually some anti-anxiety medication. It's basically the same type of medication they would use to sort of curb or lessen the mental effects of OCD. Obviously, that's not something that you can do as a helper, but it is something that you can talk to them about and steer them towards, to say, look, this is a long-term problem. This did not pop up overnight, and you clearly have problems with getting rid of stuff. Let's get you into therapy because you need it. I fear that if you continue living in this condition, we're going to find your body in here, or something's going to catch on fire, or you're going to end up in the hospital with respiratory issues. Now, that's easier to do whenever you're dealing with a severe hoard that's say level 3 or higher. But what if someone you know has a hoarding problem, but you can't quite tell if it's a hoarding problem or not? I get asked that a bunch. So are they just a collector of stuff? Is it a space issue? Or do they actually have hoarding disorder? So many hoarders refer to themselves as collectors, even the ones that are really severe. But the difference is that collections are usually displayed. They're like proudly put up on a shelf and shown off, whereas hoards are usually scattered and buried. So, for instance, we did a house of a guy who collected knives, but the knives were just ransacked across every room. He collected a whole bunch of antique cowboy-type toys, but again, they were stacked all over the living room, and then a bunch more were scattered across an inaccessible bedroom, and they had stuff piled on top of them, damaging the boxes. That's not a collection, that is hoarding, because the collection itself is being destroyed. They're not being displayed. So oftentimes in a hoard, the items themselves get damaged, or they have bug and mice feces on them, mold. They've got infestations, and they lose value because of the way they're being stored. Anything that's in a pile is going to get damaged. So if you got a friend who's a collector, or a family member who collects coffee mugs or whatever, and they're not displayed, but they're just kind of shoved off in every corner of every house, that's probably probably not a collection problem. Now, if it's a space issue, if you've got somebody who's living in a small apartment and they've got so much stuff that they can't access certain rooms, if they're willing to get rid of everything in order to bring up the more valuable space, if they're willing to do that, they probably don't have a hoarding issue. They've just got too much crap. But if they can't see the value that the space has in comparison to the stuff and they won't get rid of it, that's probably a hoarding disorder. And very often the potential of items is more valuable than the item itself in the mind of somebody with hoarding disorder. So you'll find a bunch of craft supplies that clearly have not been used in years. They've got dust all over them and mouse poop, and it's just unusable. But they still won't throw it away because they say, I can make something out of that old broken thing. Don't throw those old t-shirts away. I can turn those into dish rags. Don't throw all that old nasty yarn away because I can make a sweater out of that. They can't get past the potential of an item, and so they just keep it forever. Even though that potential's never going to be realized, it's never going to happen. That sweater only exists inside their brain. When faced with this issue, a lot of people get angry, and justifiably so. I mean, they're dealing with something they don't really understand, and so they often reach the conclusion that the person is choosing the stuff over their children, which in some cases they are doing it. They're not doing it to be malicious. Again, they have a mental illness, a severe one. And so when I talked about those lobes having diminished activity at the very beginning of this video, there's sort of a crosswire that happens where the stuff that they have becomes so embedded in their brain that throwing away that broken table or an old TV that doesn't work anymore or a bunch of craft supplies that they're never going to use, that in their brain is on par with throwing away one of their pets. And in really severe cases, it would be the same as throwing away one of their children. The idea of them doing that is so terrifying that they cannot bring themselves to do it. That's why therapy is needed. Knowing that, it brings me to the advice that you would need if you're going to help somebody with this problem. First advice is to always remember the mental issue that I just explained. You're going to have to go slow. You're going to have to take lots of breaks. You're going to have to talk about the things that you're throwing away and why. You're going to have to access their logic so you know how to get around it. I would also suggest taking one room at a time. Start in the kitchen or a living room. Wherever you're the most comfortable, start in one room and slowly go through it until it's done, because once you get an entire room done, the open space that leaves behind and the cleanliness of it and the usefulness of that room that you present to them reminds them that their house does have a function. In many cases, I'll do just a kitchen, judge their reaction, and then move on to another room, because in so many cases they'll be like, I haven't used my stove in 8 months. I think tonight I'm going to make a meal at my stove and it's going to feel so good. And so they see the positives of that room being cleaned rather than the negatives of all my stuff is being thrown in a dumpster. Speaking of dumpsters, this is the number one hardest thing to deal with when helping out a hoarding house. Dumpsters are extremely expensive. It's where the most money is going to be invested in cleaning this house up. If you have access to a dump, that's your best bet. But if not, you're going to have to get a dumpster in. And I'm telling you that the most expensive places that I've ever used for a 40-yard dumpster, which is basically the biggest non-industrial dumpster that they can get to you, is about $1,200. The cheapest I've ever done has been around $850 to $900 for 1 week. I have done houses that had so much stuff in them, we filled 10 40-yard dumpsters. So remember that not only is trash removal going to be your biggest obstacle financially and physically, but it's also possibly one of the causes that prevented them from cleaning the house in the first place. By the time they realize that a bunch of work needed to be done, then they're faced with that. Like, what do I even do with it? I can't put 100 trash bags on my curb and expect the trash man to pick them up. So they get to the point to where they're so overwhelmed, they just shut down and give up entirely. The second problem you're going to run into is infestations. I don't care how clean a house is, almost every single case of hoarding that I've ran into, with a few rare exceptions, once you start picking up boxes and piles of clothes off the floor and dishes, you're going to find roaches and or mice. The problem is you can't exterminate the pests while the mess is still active. That is providing those pests shelter. They can get underneath piles of clothes or inside boxes or under dishes, which means that when they spray or they bait or they trap, the animals have places to go. The roaches have places to go. So the poison never really gets to them. The traps never really get messed with. It also provides them food from leftover dishes in the sink, food that's all over the counter and floors. It's giving them the perfect opportunity to not only survive, but thrive and populate. So you have to clean up the mess before the exterminators can get there. And that really sucks because I've done a couple places that were so bad that you don't even want to touch the things that are in the house. But again, you can't do anything about it until the stuff is gone. And finally, be empathetic. You cannot get into a bunch of arguments with the people who have this disorder. You are going to get angry at some point. They are going to get angry at some point. At one point in this process, you are going to have to put your foot down and say, too bad. This thing is broken beyond use. It is toxic. It poses a danger. It's going in the dumpster. But you have to pick and choose your battle. That also means that there's going to be some things that you want to throw away that they don't, that you're going to have to compromise on and say, okay, you can keep this thing right here, knowing in your brain that it gives you a little bit of leeway later to throw something more important away. So, for instance, in one of the houses that I did, there was a set of chairs, dining room chairs, that were totally covered in black mold. They had water damage. They were broken. They had roach feces all over them, mouse poop, mouse pee. And I just took it outside. And when she started to throw a fit about me throwing those away, I said, I'm sorry, I'm not letting you keep these. This is the one time I'm putting my foot down. It's toxic. It's going in the dumpster. And if you don't like that, I can leave. And then she finally relented, said, no, you're right. It's not worth it. Keeping this thing, I'm never going to clean it up. It just needs to go. That's rare that they give in like that. But there are certain times where you can only be nice for so long before they start taking advantage of that and using your niceness in order to allow them to keep stuff that clearly needs to go in the garbage. So sometimes they need a system shock to step in and say, nope, you don't have a choice here. This thing is going in the trash and there's nothing we can do to stop this. It's totally ruined. It's never going to be saved. But empathy is key. 80% of the time, you want everything to be positive. You want to be happy when they throw stuff away. You want to give them positive reinforcement. 20% of the time, and this is what they teach even managers at big corporations, 80-20. 80% positive, 20% negative. When they're overstepping, when they're pushing back, that's when you have to know when to change gears. But if at all possible, I would have a professional there so that they can work through these feelings as they're getting rid of stuff. Because again, it's not normal logic. It's a severe mental disorder. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. If there's some stuff that I haven't covered, please feel free to ask them. I've got a lot of people in the comments who have had to deal with this stuff before. They have experience and knowledge, and they're very kind-hearted people. They would be happy to answer your questions. If you want to talk to me directly, I'm on Discord. You can only access my Discord if you're in the paid membership, but I'm always on Discord. So if you ever have a question, please hit me up. I'll be happy to answer it, to walk you through the problems or solutions. But members, I will see you this coming Wednesday. Everybody else, I'll see you next weekend. Later.